Chapter 1. When the editor of Every Woman's World asked me to write the story of my career, I smiled with a little touch of incredulous amusement. My career? Had I a career? Was not, should not a career be something splendid, wonderful, spectacular at the very least, something varied and exciting? Could my long, uphill struggle through many quiet, uneventful years be termed a career? It had never occurred to me to call it so, and on first thought, it did not seem to me that there was much to be said about that same long, monotonous struggle. But it appeared to be a whim of the aforesaid editor that I should say what little there was to be said, and in those same long years I acquired the habit of accommodating myself to the whims of editors to such an inveterate degree that I have not yet been able to shake it off. So I shall cheerfully tell my tame story. If it does nothing else, it may serve to encourage some other toiler who is struggling along in the weary pathway I once followed to success. Many years ago, when I was still a child, I clipped from a current magazine a bit of verse entitled "To the Fringed Gentian" and pasted it on the cover of the little portfolio on which I wrote my letters and school essays. Every time I opened the portfolio, I read one of those verses over. It was the keynote of my every aim and ambition. Then whisper, blossom, in thy sleep, how I may upward climb the Alpine path, so hard, so steep, that leads to heights sublime, how I may reach that far-off goal of true and honored fame, and write upon its shining scroll a woman's humble name. It is indeed a hard and steep path, and if any word I can write will assist or encourage another pilgrim along that path, that word I will gladly and willingly write. I was born in the little village of Clifton, Prince Edward Island. Old Prince Edward Island is a good place in which to be born, a good place in which to spend a childhood. I can think of none better. We Prince Edward Islanders are a loyal race. In our secret soul, we believe that there is no place like the little province that gave us birth. We may suspect that it isn't quite perfect, any more than any other spot on this planet, but you will not catch us admitting it, and how furiously we will hate anyone who does say it. The only way to inveigle a Prince Edward Islander into saying anything in dispraise of his beloved province is to praise it extravagantly to him. Then, in order to deprecate the wrath of the gods and veil decently his own bursting pride, he will, perhaps, be induced to state that it has one or two drawbacks, mere spots on the sun. But his hearer must not commit the unpardonable sin of agreeing with him. Prince Edward Island, however, is really a beautiful province, the most beautiful place in America, I believe. Elsewhere, there are more lavish landscapes and grander scenery, but for chaste, restful loveliness, it is unsurpassed. Compassed by the inviolate sea, it floats on the waves of the blue gulf, a green seclusion and haunt of ancient peace. Much of the beauty of the island is due to the vivid color contrasts, the rich red of the winding roads, the brilliant emerald of the uplands and meadows, the glowing sapphire of the encircling sea. It is the sea which makes Prince Edward Island in more senses than the geographical. You cannot get away from the sea down there. Save for a few places in the interior, it is ever visible somewhere. If only in a tiny blue gap between distant hills, or a turquoise gleams through the dark boughs of spruce fringing an estuary. Great is our love for it. Its tang gets in our blood. Its siren call rings ever in our ears. And no matter where we wander in lands afar, the murmur of its waves ever summons us back in our dreams to the homeland. For few things am I more thankful than for the fact that I was born and bred beside that blue St. Lawrence Gulf. And yet, we cannot define the charm of Prince Edward Island in terms of land or sea. It is too elusive, too subtle. Sometimes I have thought it was the touch of austerity in an island landscape that gives it its peculiar charm. And whence comes that austerity? Is it in the dark dappling of spruce and fir? Is it in the glimpses of sea and river? Is it in the bracing tang of the salt air? Or does it go deeper still, down to the very soul of the land? For lands have personalities just as well as human beings. And to know that personality, you must live in the land and companion it, and draw sustenance of body and spirit from it. So only can you really know a land and be known of it. My father was Hugh John Montgomery. My mother was Clara Woolner MacNeil. So I come of Scotch ancestry, a dash of English, from several grands and greats. There were many traditions and tales on both sides of the family, to which, as a child, I listened with delight, while my elders talked them over around winter firesides. The romance of them was in my blood. I thrilled to the lure of adventure which had led my forefathers westward from the old land, a land which I always heard referred to as home by men and women whose parents were Canadian born and bred. Hugh Montgomery came to Canada from Scotland. He sailed on a vessel bound for Quebec, but the fates and a woman's will took a hand in the thing. His wife was desperately seasick all the way across the Atlantic, and a voyage over the Atlantic was no 5 days' run then. Off the north shore of Prince Edward Island, then a wild, wooded land with settlements few and far between, the captain hove to in order to replenish his supply of water. He sent a boat ashore, and he told poor Mrs. Montgomery that she might go in it for a little change. Mrs. Montgomery did go in it, and when she felt that blessed dry land under her feet once more, she told her husband that she meant to stay there. Never again would she set foot in any vessel. Expostulation, entreaty, arguments, all availed nothing. There the poor lady was resolved to stay, and there perforce her husband had to stay with her. So the Montgomerys came to Prince Edward Island. Their son Donald, my great-grandfather, was the hero of another romance of those early days. I have used this tale in my book, The Story Girl. The Nancy and Betty Sherman of the story told there were Nancy and Betsy Penman, daughters of a United Empire Loyalist who came from the States at the close of the War of Independence. George Penman had been a paymaster in the British Army. Having forfeited all his property, he was very poor, but the beauty of the Penman girls, especially Nancy, was so great that they had no lack of suitors from far and near. The Donald Fraser of the Story Girl was Donald Montgomery, and Neil Campbell was David Murray of Baddeck. The only embroidery I permitted myself in telling the tale was to give Donald a horse and cutter. In reality, what he had was a half-broke steer hitched to a rude old wood sled, and it was with this romantic equipage that he hied him over to Richmond Bay to propose to Nancy. My grandfather, Senator Montgomery, was the son of Donald and Nancy, and inherited his stately presence and handsome face from his mother. He married his first cousin, Annie Murray of Baddeck, the daughter of David and Betsy, so that Nancy and Betsy were both my great-grandmothers. If Betsy were alive today, I have no doubt she would be an ardent suffragette. The most advanced feminist could hardly spurn old conventions more effectually than she did when she proposed to David. I may add that I was always told that she and David were the happiest couple in the world. It was from my mother's family, the MacNeils, that I inherited my knack of writing and my literary tastes. John MacNeil had come to Prince Edward Island in 1775. His family belonged to Argyllshire and had been adherents of the unfortunate Stuarts. Consequently, young MacNeil found that a change of climate would probably be beneficial. Hector MacNeil, a minor Scottish poet, was a cousin of his. He was the author of several beautiful and well-known lyrics, among them Saw ye my wee thing, saw ye my ain thing, I la ne'er a laddie but one, and come under my plaidie. The latter often and erroneously attributed to Burns. John McNeill settled on a North Shore farm in Cavendish and had a family of 12 children, the oldest being William McNeill, my great-grandfather, commonly known as Old Speaker McNeill. He was a very clever man, well educated for those times, and exercised a wide influence in provincial politics. He married Eliza Townsend, whose father was Captain John Townsend of the British Navy. His father, James Townsend, had received a grant of Prince Edward Island land from George III, which he called Park Corner after the old family estate in England. Thither he came bringing his wife. Bitterly homesick she was, rebelliously so. For weeks after her arrival she would not take off her bonnet, but walked the floor in it, imperviously demanding to be taken home. We children who heard the tale never wearied of speculating as to whether she took off her bonnet at night and put it on again in the morning, or whether she slept in it. But back home she could not go, so eventually she took off her bonnet and resigned herself to her fate. Very peacefully she sleeps in the little old family graveyard on the banks of the Lake of Shining Waters. In other words, Campbell's Pond at Park Corner. An old red sandstone slab marks the spot where she and her husband lie, and on it is carved this moss-grown epitaph, one of the diffuse epitaphs of a generation that had time to carve such epitaphs, and time to read them. To the memory of James Townsend, of Park Corner, Prince Edward Island, also of Elizabeth, his wife. They immigrated from England to this island A.D. 1775 with 2 sons and 3 daughters, John, James, Eliza, Rachel, and Mary. Their son John died in Antigua in the lifetime of his parents. His afflicted mother followed him into eternity with patient resignation on the 17th day of April, 1795, in the 69th year of her age. And her disconsolate husband departed this life on the 25th day of December, 1806, in the 87th year of his age. I wonder if any homesick dreams haunt Elizabeth Townsend's slumber of over 100 years. William and Eliza McNeill had a large family, of which all the members possessed marked intellectual power. Their education consisted only in the scanty occasional terms of the district school of those rude early days. But, had circumstances been kinder, some of them would have climbed high. My grandfather, Alexander McNeill, was a man of strong and pure literary tastes, with a considerable knack of prose composition. My great-uncle, William McNeill, could write excellent satirical verse, but his older brother, James McNeill, was a born poet. He composed hundreds of poems, which he would sometimes recite to favored persons. They were never written down, and not a line of them, so far as I know, is now extant. But I heard my grandfather repeat many of them, and they were real poetry, most of them being satirical or mock-heroic. They were witty, pointed, and dramatic. Uncle James was something of a mute, inglorious Burns. Circumstances compelled him to spend his life on a remote Prince Edward Island farm. Had he had the advantages of education that are within the reach of any schoolboy today, I'm convinced he would have been neither mute nor inglorious. The Aunt Mary Lawson, to whom I dedicated the story girl, was another daughter of William and Eliza McNeill. No story of my career would be complete without a tribute to her, for she was one of the most formative influences on my childhood. She was really quite the most wonderful woman in many respects that I have ever known. She had not had any educational advantages, but she had a naturally powerful mind, a keen intelligence, and a most remarkable memory, which retained to the day of her death all that she had ever heard or read or seen. She was a brilliant conversationalist, and it was a treat to get Aunt Mary started on tales and recollections of her youth, and all the vivid doings and sayings of the folk in those young years of the province. We were chums, she and I. when she was in her 70s and I was in my teens. I cannot, in any words at my command, pay the debt I owe to Aunt Mary Lawson. When I was 21 months old, my mother died in the old home at Cavendish after a lingering illness. I distinctly remember seeing her in her coffin. It is my earliest memory. My father was standing by the casket, holding me in his arms. I wore a little white dress of embroidered muslin, and father was crying. Women were seated around the room, and I recall two in front of me on the sofa who were whispering to each other and looking pityingly at father and me. Behind them the window was open, and green vines were trailing across it while their shadows danced over the floor in a square of sunshine. I looked down at mother's dead face. It was a sweet face, albeit worn and wasted by months of suffering. My mother had been beautiful, and death, so cruel in all else, had spared the delicate outline of feature, the long silken lashes brushing the hollow cheek, and the smooth masses of golden brown hair. I did not feel any sorrow, for I knew nothing of what it all meant. I was only vaguely troubled. Why was mother so still, and why was father crying? I reached down and laid my baby hand against my mother's cheek. Even yet I can feel the coldness of that touch. Somebody in the room sobbed and said, "Poor child." The chill of mother's face had frightened me. I turned and put my arms appealingly around father's neck, and he kissed me. Comforted, I looked down again at the sweet, placid face as he carried me away. That one precious memory is all I have of the girlish mother who sleeps in the old burying ground of Cavendish, lulled forever by the murmur of the sea. End of chapter 1.